Hello and welcome to PHRC Raising the Standard. It's brought to you today by the Paducah Human Rights Commission and the City of Paducah. I am your host, Gary Reese, and today's topic is the psychology and pathology of abuse. And we have today with us two great guests, Lori Wells Brown, who is the Executive Director of the Purchase Area Sexual Assault and Child Advocacy Center. Welcome, Lori. And we have also with us Kelly Morrow, who is a clinical coordinator with the Purchase Area Sexual Assault and Child Advocacy Center. So welcome, and we're glad to have you with us today. If you don't mind, let's take a couple minutes and just tell us just a little bit about yourselves and just a little bit about your agency to get us started, please.
Sure. My name is Kelly Morrow, and like you said, I'm the clinical coordinator at PASAC. So I provide therapy services to our clients, and I also supervise the therapist and coordinate the services that are provided through the clinical program.
Okay.
And I am the director, Gary, but I also serve as a therapist as well as a forensic interviewer. And Kelly and I both have backgrounds in clinical psychology.
Okay.
And PASAC is your state-designated regional rape crisis and child advocacy program, serving all 8 counties of the Purchase area and surrounding areas. As a dual rape crisis and child advocacy program, we serve child victims of all forms of abuse as well as all age survivors of sexual violence. We see little ones as young as a year-old as well as elderly individuals well into their 90s.
Wow. Okay.
Our specialists provide a comprehensive approach where survivors and their supportive family members can receive all of the necessary services to help them through the entire process, from crisis through healing to long-term recovery, all free of charge. And we also provide prevention education programming to both youth and adults in the community, as well as specialized professional training to our community partners. And we help to facilitate a multidisciplinary approach, really promoting the best coordinated response to victims across the region.
Right. Well, that's a lot of services.
It is.
All right. That's a mouthful, doing it.
It is.
All right. We want to focus a little bit on, or actually quite a bit on abuse today. And but I think whenever we get started, when we talk about child abuse, I think we need to actually define what abuse really is.
Well, Gary, there are 4 types of child maltreatment. Okay. Neglect is failure to provide for a child's basic needs, such as food, clothing, or shelter, or to ensure adequate supervision. Emotional abuse is any pattern of behavior that impairs a child's emotional development or their sense of self-worth. Such behaviors as constant criticism, threats, or rejection, or withholding love, support, those types of things.
Right.
Physical abuse is a physical injury that results from hitting, punching, kicking, beating, choking, shaking, any such behavior that would cause harm to a child. And that kind of injury is considered abuse whether or not the person actually intended to hurt the child in that way.
Right.
And then sexual abuse is the use or coercion or force of a child to engage in sexual acts or the imitation of sexual acts. And sexual abuse does include exploitation through prostitution as well as exposure to or production of pornography.
Right.
What we know through the work with children at our center, as well as recent research, is that many children experience more than one type of abuse.
Right, right. Well, we know that statistically at the national level, we have probably about 30% of the children are physically abused. There's estimates that somewhere around 20% of the children are sexually abused, and probably somewhere around 10% in addition to that are emotionally abused. And a lot of state agencies, including Kentucky, it's not unusual to have 600,000 or so cases a year. How prevalent is that in this area, those types of abuse?
Child abuse is very prevalent in the United States and unfortunately is considered a relatively common experience in the lives of our children, with 1 out of every 4 experiencing some type of abuse before they reach adulthood.
Wow.
It really is one of our nation's most pressing public health and social concerns, and it impacts all children, irrespective of their age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or geographic location. So no community is immune to child abuse, and unfortunately neither is Kentucky or our Purchase area region. In fact, we have seen that the number of reports that meet the criteria for investigation has steadily increased each year across Kentucky, including here in the Purchase area, and it's increased by 25% just since 2010. And Kentucky Child Protective Services in 2014 received about 80,200 reports about, concerns about the well-being of children, and 2,500 of those were here in the Purchase area.
Wow.
Yes, and of those 2,500 reports that were pertaining to kids here in the Purchase area, about 665 of those were substantiated that abuse had occurred, and 335 were children here in McCracken County.
Wow.
So while these numbers are really alarming, what's even more alarming is that we highly suspect, that about 90% of all child abuse cases go unreported.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a large number. Definitely a large
it is.
number. And it kind of gets to my second question here about the number that's unreported. Statistics seem to tell us that a lot of children that are abused are under the age of 4. So is that something that would also be true here in Paducah, do you think?
It is.
Okay.
Actually, of the kids that our Kentucky Child Advocacy Center served last year, about a third of those children were ages 0 to 4.
Wow.
About 15% of the children that we served last year were 4 years of age or younger.
Okay. All right. And so why do you think that's the case? Why do you think that young children tend to be targeted that frequently?
Well, infants and young children are more vulnerable to abuse because they are little and they need constant care, and so they're more prone to being victims of particular kinds of abuse, such as shaking. So for a caregiver who may be overwhelmed or overstressed and they don't know how to respond to persistent crying, so that stress may lead to cases of child abuse with those kids.
Right.
Also, I think in addition to just being more dependent on caregivers, little ones have limited verbal skills,
Right.
so they're not able to tell about their experiences. They're also less likely to be able to anticipate danger, to know how to respond to danger, and less likely to know how to keep themselves safe.
Right.
And children who have severe disabilities or chronic illnesses are also at greater risk because that again puts more potential stress on caregivers.
Right. And if you couple that with the fact that, or statistically speaking, that probably 90% of children that are abused, especially at that age group, are abused by people that family members or caregivers or something like that, then that's obviously a very tragic situation. And I know you don't deal with perpetrators per se, but you obviously have some information about perpetrators when you have to deal with victims. What percentage would you say, or what type of perpetrators do you typically violate or victimize children?
Well, I think the statistic that you referenced, that 90% of children are abused by someone they know, is actually accurate. And of the kids that we see, usually about 60% are abused by a family member who lives in the same home. And about 25% of those kids are abused by a parent or a step-parent.
Right.
The younger the child, the more likely they are to be abused by a family member. And then for the remainder of kids that we see, they're likely to be abused by maybe a friend of the family, a neighbor, another kind of acquaintance, maybe the family member of a friend. Also, kids are often abused by an adult who's in a position of authority, such as a youth group leader, a coach, a teacher. Again, unfortunately, someone that the child should be able to trust.
Right.
So most of the kids that we see, they do experience ongoing abuse by someone that they know, and again, they should really be able to trust.
Right. Exactly. I want to get in a little bit into the I guess the physiological aspects or psychological, pathological aspects. Is there a correlation between the maltreatment of a child and brain development?
Child traumatic stress occurs when children or adolescents are exposed to some type of traumatic event or situation. And when that exposure is overwhelming and they don't have the capacity to be able to manage their experience of that, that's how the traumatic stress develops.
Right.
So the impact of child traumatic stress really depends upon the developmental stages that the child is in and kind of what is happening in their brain, what organization is happening and the functions that are developing. We know that most of the brain organization and development happens within the first 4 years of life. So, like Lori said, those children age 4 and younger are most susceptible to experiencing some kind of childhood trauma. So that really does put them in the position of having some difficulties with how the brain structures are formed, the functions that are formed during that time period. It can set children up for having problems with dysregulation. We know that the brain develops in a bottom-up process. So the things like your heart rate, your respiration, your nervous system, all of those functions develop either in utero or kind of into infancy. So, that's really those core areas of the brain that are responsible for regulation and you being able to manage distress. So those children are more likely to have difficulties with managing distress, being able to calm themselves down. The brain also, it continues to develop really into adulthood, and the brain's not fully developed until the early 20s. So that's why you see a lot of times children and teens have difficulties with things like problem solving, decision making, kind of logical reasoning kind of skills. So really this early childhood trauma can set kids up for having a variety of issues, whether it's mental health or physiological kinds of issues later on down the road.
Well, what would be some of those? For example, say a child is abused early ages, below 4, and then they get into, say, elementary school, and then if you don't mind, I kind of elaborate on some of those that might be typical that a school teacher might see, or somebody who works in a daycare center might be, that maybe they don't understand what a child's gone through, but maybe they can see that because of certain behaviors, maybe they were abused at an early age. Can you explain what some of those, how that manifests itself, maybe in elementary and on through, if you can?
Okay. And the really challenging thing with especially childhood sexual abuse, but with any kind of childhood trauma, is that there's not like a one-size-fits-all in that every child who's experienced this is going to respond in this way. There are some commonalities in what we see as far as different behavioral, social, emotional kinds of problems. Behaviorally, we see a lot of times kids have problems with like regressive behavior. They may have developed some skills, particularly things like potty training. They may have mastered that skill, but something will happen and they'll all of a sudden have like a regressive kind of behavior. You can see extremes of children being very withdrawn and shy, to the other end of the spectrum where they may display like aggressive behaviors, be more emotionally reactive, have those temper tantrums, be hard to calm and soothe. Emotionally, a lot of times kids have problems with anxiety disorders. That's really the biggest problem with children. Those emotional reactions, they may be dealing with things like guilt, shame, a lot of depression, like I said, anxiety. And socially, there are a lot of impacts on the social relationships. We all have templates for how we interact with people and the world and kind of what those relationships in our life look like. And our templates for that really develop starting in utero when the child's in the mother's womb, and that continues on, throughout life. Unfortunately, for a lot of kids that we see, like Lori mentioned, they experience not just one type of trauma, but multiple types of trauma. So during their life, they may have developed templates about relationships based on their interactions with their caregivers, where it's not a supportive, nurturing caregiver. That person may be very chaotic. They may learn that their needs can't be met. They may realize that the world is not a safe place. And that kind of persists on into other relationships too. That's why you see a lot of times difficulties with peers, where the child may either avoid social relationships or can become aggressive. They may indiscriminately attach to other people, where they just kind of develop relationships with having very little like personal knowledge and time spent with that person.
And so I guess then that could be very detrimental to a person's well-being, especially as it gets into adolescence, because you mentioned that someone might be willing to attach themselves to someone that they don't know that much about, or or they have other problems with relationships. Could you expand on that just a little bit?
A lot of the problems that we see during childhood, they continue on into adolescence, whether the adolescent experience that early childhood trauma or it's events that happen during their teen years. And again, there's behavioral, social, relational, emotional kinds of issues that come up. Some of the biggest things that teens will experience are problems with like depression, anxiety. We see them having a lot of self-injury, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, some of those really big risky kind of behaviors. That's where you see a lot of times they get into like substance abuse problems and things like that. Relationally, that low self-esteem really can set them up to have some challenges with like identifying and developing healthy relationships. They may be more likely to develop unhealthy relationships. A lot of times these adolescents will kind of develop that belief that sex equals love because the person who engaged in that sexually abusive behavior was somebody that they loved and trust. So they equate that with those relationships. So you can see like some of that sexual promiscuity and some of those types of problems. Like I said before, that risk-taking behavior and indiscriminately attaching to people can cause them to potentially be in situations that could lead them to experience even more trauma.
Yeah. You mentioned substance abuse. What about criminal behavior? What about is there a likelihood, or is there more of a likelihood that a person that's been sexually abused early on or any time through life because of the trauma might be more prone to engage in some kind of criminal activity, maybe even abuse themselves? Yeah. Could you elaborate on that just a little?
Yeah, there is a correlation both between like the substance abuse and the criminal activity, and that really kind of goes back to some of those risk-taking behaviors. With the substance abuse, that has the potential to be a criminal behavior. Individuals with childhood trauma histories are 13 times more likely to develop problems with alcohol and 26 times more likely to develop problems with drugs. So a lot of times they're using that as a way to cope with the negative reactions that they're having, those emotional reactions that are very intense and overwhelming, that if they didn't have the opportunity to engage in early treatment to deal with those things, they may not know how to cope with that effectively. And the same goes for the criminal behavior. There is looking at children in the DJJ system, those individuals who are incarcerated, there's a strong connection there, and that goes back to some of those brain development kind of questions about they may not have the capacity for those logical thinking skills. They, because of the attachment disruption, may have some challenges with empathy and kind of understanding what impacts another person. They may have impulse control problems, which are all things that kind of lead somebody to be more likely to have that impulsive decision making and engage in those behaviors.
Besides the psychological parts, do you think that as far as a person that's been abused, do you think too that there's some kind of learned pattern that they learned? Perhaps they think, well, this is the way that I was disciplined as a child. Maybe then they follow the same pattern with their own children. Is that something that's common?
Yeah, we do see that a lot of times. And again, thinking about like those attachment relationships and the templates that we develop for the world and how we interact with it, that is definitely a learned thing. And it also goes back to some of those physiological things. If you're more likely to be if your stress response system is already compromised and you're more likely to be overwhelmed by something, it's easier to fall into doing like shaking a baby if you're upset, or some of those kind of behaviors.
Okay. There was a study back in 1996 that suggested that 80% of people children, or I should say people over the age of 21, they're not children obviously, but they're young adults, 80% of the people over 21 had some kind of diagnosable psychological disorder. Do you think that's still true?
I mean, we definitely see a lot of individuals who have diagnosable mental health issues, and all of the people we see have experienced childhood trauma. So, there's definitely a correlation there. We know, looking at statistics, those people who have histories of childhood trauma are 3 times more likely to develop depression. They're 6 times more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And even looking at like suicidal ideation and contemplation of that, they're 4 times more likely to have that suicidal behavior as well.
Right. If you would explain some of the services that your agency provides not only to children, but to adults that have been abused or sexually assaulted.
Well, given the serious and long-lasting effects of child traumatic stress that we've been talking about here today, certainly early intervention is critical to children's long-term health and well-being. And so that is our goal, to be able to provide intervention services as early as we can. Our child advocacy program is a community-based program where professionals who are involved in these cases can come together and provide a comprehensive service approach. We're able to make decisions about the treatment, the investigation, and the prosecution of these child abuse cases. And this multidisciplinary approach really does help to reduce the trauma, for the children who have already been affected, and also reduce victimization of other children as well. And, for us, whether we're providing specialized child sexual abuse exams at our center, or we're providing medical advocacy to victims who present to local emergency rooms, we're working to ensure that the immediate health needs of both child and adult victims are met as early as we can, and that they are able to receive those advocacy services that will help give them some education and information so that they're able to make critical decisions about their health and their choices in the legal system to make informed decisions.
Right.
Our crisis response, our advocacy, and our forensic services really do help jumpstart the healing process, and again, to be able to help connect them to critical resources, give them information, and to help provide services about the importance of treatment. In addition to I think, trying to meet those immediate health and safety considerations, we're also providing services that are going to help reduce the long-term impact on health of children that we've been talking about here today. And we really work to do that through both our clinical therapy services as well as our holistic health program.
Okay. I know that you all provide a lot of counseling and therapy services, but and you may have mentioned this, but you also provide some forensic type services to law enforcement, like forensic interviewing or something, or at least provide a setting so these children who have been abused, or adults for that matter, who have been abused, can be interviewed, and the investigation portion can begin. Can you expand on that?
Usually at the onset of a new child abuse investigation, the first thing that investigators in our area do is they actually call us and they set up what is called a forensic interview with a child. So we have trained forensic interviewers who have mental health backgrounds who meet with the child one-on-one, and they're trained to provide a very empirically based interview that really facilitates, I think, the best environment for a child to feel safe and to feel comfortable and to be able to tell their story in their own words. Our investigators are actually able to watch that interview over closed circuit television. This forensic interview really is one of the most critical pieces of evidence in the investigation that's going to kind of set whether or not this investigation can move forward successfully. So we really want to make sure that this is the best experience for the child to be able to tell as much as they can about what they've experienced. And then following that forensic interview, our staff and our community partners meet and then talk about the outcome of that interview, and also what other kinds of services might be important, for that child. And our advocates are meeting with the caregivers to explain that process, and again, to also help them understand what they can expect throughout that process as well.
Yeah. If you don't mind, explain a little bit about some of the other agencies. You mentioned community partners, but I know the police. You're probably since you're doing, or some of your people are doing forensic interviews, I guess they have to go and testify in court.
Right.
So obviously you have to have some kind of relationship with the prosecutors and their offices. Could you expand on that just a little bit and tell us what some of those partners that, from the criminal justice side of it, that you all might have to be involved with?
Yes, Gary. The multidisciplinary team approach really is the foundation for our child advocacy program. So all the professionals who are involved in these child abuse cases, which would include our law enforcement, our child protective services, as well as our prosecutors, and then any other child youth victim service and agencies within the community. We work very closely with them throughout these cases. We want to have as many successful investigations and prosecution outcomes, as possible. And we also even work with, say, our judges as far as offering training to help them learn how to understand the impact of abuse and how to talk to child victims. One of the things that we've been most excited about this last year is that we're actually seeing more and more of these cases move successfully through the legal system. So we feel like, that multidisciplinary approach, which we actually have a team in every county throughout the purchase area, is really the core of seeing that positive change.
Right. Okay.
These cases are really the most difficult for our officers to investigate and our prosecutors to prosecute, because usually it's just the word of the child and the adult. And when I say it's just the word, we know the importance of the word of that child. But, for that child to be able to testify in a court and to undergo everything that's involved in the legal system, it's really challenging.
The case has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's a big hurdle to have to get over. So, okay, all right.
We've had little ones as young as 5 and 6 who testify in an open court.
Yeah, it's tough on them. Yeah. If you don't mind, explain what the reporting requirements are in Kentucky. As far as reporting child abuse.
Any person who knows or suspects that a child has been abused or neglected has a responsibility to make a report either over the telephone or in writing. And when you make a report, it doesn't mean that you know for certain that abuse has happened. It means that there's reasonable suspicion that this has occurred. It really is the job of Child Protective Services to conduct the investigation and to confirm whether or not the abuse has occurred.
Okay, all right. And if the average person out there believes a child has been abused, who should that person contact?
They should contact Child Protective Services, and they can call 1-877-SAFE-KY, or they can make an online report at www.reportitky.org.
Okay, all right. If you don't mind, there's a lot of people out there that probably are very interested in your organization, and they would probably like to either volunteer into something or get somehow involved in what you all do. If you don't mind explaining a little bit about how someone might, if they're interested in helping out, what they might do or who they might contact, and some of the services that they might be involved in.
Well, we certainly believe that every child should have the freedom of feeling safe in the world, feeling safe in their own home, and safe in their own bodies. And at PASAC, we really believe it is the responsibility of our community to come together and ensure that fundamental right of safety for our kids. So we offer lots of opportunities and welcome, ways for adults to become involved in our mission. As part of our vision to actively engage adults, we offer what's called the Darkness to Light Stewards of Children, and it's a prevention education program that's aimed towards adults, and it really helps them to understand how to prevent, to recognize, and to respond appropriately to child sexual abuse. And so if someone has a group, such as maybe a group that they work with, or a civic organization, or a faith-based organization who might be interested in that training, please contact our center. April is also Child Abuse Prevention Month, so we have a month-long schedule of all kinds of activities, and we would love to have members of the community become involved in those, so they can check out more information on our website or like our Facebook page, because we're going to be sending out information about lots of these activities and ways that individuals can become involved. And then of course we have lots of other ways that people can volunteer and also donate to support our mission that's also available on our website as well.
Okay, all right. Well, we'd really appreciate you all being here, Ms. Brown and Ms. Morrow, and thanks so much for your time. We learned a lot from you all today, and I want to thank you for joining us today at the PHRC Raising the Standard. See you next time. Thank you.